Hello and welcome to the fourth installment in my game diary series, where I will recap the events of the heavily modified game of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition that I run. I'll talk a little bit of the homebrew that was used and possibly homebrew that will come up later on. Hopefully extrapolate some lessons that could be used going forward, and also just talk about future plans for future sessions. Now, this was a pretty crazy game. A lot happened, specifically towards the tail end of the game, and this video is probably going to be very, very long because of it. Just know that there is quite a bit of player death, or rather, player character death. Nobody died in real life. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Let's just start at the beginning of this session and then go through the motions. As established last session, at the very end, the party talks to the Earl of Mossstone, which is the town the party last left off at, and from him they got a letter of recommendation, basically recommending their services as freelance adventurers, I guess, to the Earl of Chandler and also another Earl for a different county, but that doesn't come up quite yet. The important thing is that they have a reason to go to Chandler, and they have an in with the Earl, who is like a very important, powerful guy, even though he's been kind of neglecting his responsibilities by just being a paranoid lunatic hiding up in his castle, while mercenary groups take over abandoned forts and orcs attack trade routes and all kinds of crazy stuff that he's just ignoring. But the party has an in, and they're gonna do anything they can to get some kind of property rights in order to start their little vineyard, which is probably not going to be profitable, but oh well. I'll put the map up now, but instead of going all the way down then up again, they decide to just cut across the open area in order to save time. And just as the sun's about to set, before they set up camp, they do see off in the distance, not too far away, just a little bit over a hill, there is a statue and a cemetery, and they notice the head of the statue get pulled off. Obviously, vandalism of some kind, and that's what tips the party off that something's wrong. Taliesin, the warlock of the Raven Queen, sends her raven to go investigate, rolls exceptionally well, and very plainly sees that there is some kind of wizard who has reanimated several skeletons and was using them to pull down the statue. Obviously, this is a necromancer who is doing necromancy, animating dead, and tearing down the statue because the statue is of Thone, who in the setting is the god of funerals and also the god of judges. He has a whole bunch of lore which I'll eventually talk about when it's relevant. All that matters now is that he's basically the god of funerals and final goodbyes and eternal rest. So there being a necromancer here animating the dead and tearing down the statue, big thing. Obviously something that the party does not want happening because they're generally good people, kind of, maybe a little bit. But more importantly, they know how much of a pain it is to fight undead and how dangerous they can be if there's a lot of them. They approach not stealthily, just very locally, in fact. I believe Rhinos goes first, who he is the monk, who is not Kensei yet because he hasn't chosen his subclass, but he is a monk, and basically announces the party's presence, and immediately the necromancer is hostile, and he points at them, and to kick off combat, as a bonus action, he shouts, "Strike them down," because for undead, you have to use your bonus action to give them a command. And I had him say strike them down because I want to demonstrate something with how I run skeletons, not just in this game, but in general. And that is that I like the idea that animate dead, these zombies and skeletons, serve two separate roles other than the fact that one's generally ranged. Zombies are slow, clumsy, and stupid, but if you give them a command, it has to be a very simple, maybe even like a one-word command, and it'll just do that in the broadest sense. Point at a guy and say attack, it'll rip him to shreds eventually. Point to the ground and say guard, it'll stay in that spot and attack anyone who comes near it. You say wander, it'll just wander away. Skeletons, on the other hand, I like the idea that because they're a little bit more intelligent, that they're almost robotic in how literal they take commands. You could give skeletons extremely, extremely complicated commands that are full of conditions and qualifiers and all this stuff, and it'll follow them to the letter as literal as possible. Which means when the necromancer pointed at the party and said, strike them down, that's what they intended to do. When the skeletons' turn came up, they all charged at the party, including the ones with bows and arrows. And the ones with bows and arrows ran up and started hitting the party over the head with the bows because he said strike them down. They're striking them, and they're going to keep doing that until they go down. The kind of puzzle for this encounter would be that if the party dropped prone, then the skeletons won't attack for the rest of that round, or at least until the necromancer uses his bonus action to command the undead to just like stab them. At which point the skeletons with bows would probably use their arrows, which will do like 1 piercing damage, and then he'll angrily command them to shoot them, and then they'll shoot them into melee range. Basically, the joke is that the party has to keep doing things that confuse the skeletons because their orders are so specific, and the necromancer keeps messing up and giving vague, weird commands instead of just giving extreme precise details. He just has to say, skeleton swords, stab them, bow skeletons, go to the back and shoot them from range. But he didn't do that because he's kind of an idiot, even though like mechanically he should be smarter. I like the idea that he's just a dumb necromancer. And he did have some pretty intense spells, which he didn't really get to use. He did eventually use Shield against Mike's rogue's short bow attack. It crit on the casting, because again, we use a roll to cast system. He crits on the shield, so he blocks it, and they said, was it reflect? I said, yeah, it'll reflect. So I had to make a spell attack to see if he could actually reflect it back and hit somebody, and it crit failed the spell attack. I'll put the little screenshot roll up front because it's funny. And that was hysterical. And so what happened was Mike shot at him. He put up a shield and it bounced off and hit one of his own skeletons and did some damage. Not as much because skeletons are resistant to piercing damage. At least these skeletons are. I have it so skeletons are resistant to piercing and slashing, but they are vulnerable to bludgeoning damage. So the party can deal with them because most of them do pretty good bludgeoning damage. Taliesin commanded her raven to fly over and drop a rock that had magic stone cast on it on one of the skeletons to do damage. And I basically said, hey, I don't think this guy should be able to make attacks. Bo said that it's technically not a familiar, so it can make attacks. I still don't like the idea of it making attacks because it just doesn't feel right. So I said it could drop them, but those attacks are made with disadvantage. Which is funny because I don't think she ever really hits any of her marks. Even in the goblin fight in the first session, she threw rocks in the melee range and still missed, which is disadvantage, so obviously. But with this, and then what happens with a fight later on, Magic Stone is just not a good spell for this character. He really should have just chosen Eldritch Blast. Really, the spells chosen for this character are pretty poor, and we'll get into a whole tirade about that, but we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. The crit shield actually happens after that, but I already talked about that, so party fights some more. I think it actually is a magic stone that knocks down the necromancer and kills him, and then his undead are still animate. This is the point where he didn't give them a new command, so if they just dropped prone now, then the skeletons just wouldn't hit them, because if they're down, they can't strike them down. They're already down, so the party could just crawl away or attack them while they're on the ground completely unimpeded. And also a house rule is that you can drop prone as a reaction. There is probably rules for choosing to willingly fall prone. I just can't find them anywhere, and it does make sense that you're able to, like, as a reaction, fall prone without using movement. Just letting your legs give out seems a lot more realistic as, like, a free action or, like, a reaction than, like, spending half your movement to fall prone, because obviously getting up is going to take more energy and focus than just lying down. While this fight is happening, I'm getting more and more angry at the lack of little token signifiers that Roll20 has, and Usopp tells me that there is one that works, and I'm saying I'm not finding it. He says to scroll down, and I discovered that you could actually scroll down on Roll20's little status effect selector, and that pissed me off because I wish I knew that so much sooner. So I just have to learn to scroll down on everything now. The skeletons are still fighting the party at this time, though, and Camille does go down, but he is stabilized either by, I want to say it was either Taliesin or Rhinos, but it may have been Ronnie, I'm not sure. Someone stabilized Camille. With the necromancer killed, they fight off the rest of the skeletons and decide to loot the guy. On him, they find some money. They find a silvered dagger. Obviously, he's a necromancer. He wants to do crazy rituals and shit with undead, so a silver dagger would come in handy. It'll also come up later, which I'll maybe talk about in this video, maybe not. It's a long ways away, so I'm not super worried about it. But the important thing is that they get the spell book. I'll put up what spells he has right now, but just know that with the value of the spell book and all the spells in it, I have it appraised at 700 gold pieces, which the party could sell or turn into the church that they're going to be by, or do something with it where they get gold out of it. It was part of my idea of giving the party more gold so they get to level 2 by the end of the session. Spoiler alert, it doesn't happen, unfortunately. The exact opposite of that happens, basically, but we'll get to that when we get to that. They camp for the night and then begin moving northward towards Chandler's Cove in the morning. While traveling, they encounter a family from Greyland who was kicked out of the city, and the brief conversation involves making reference to anyone who shows up in the city from Greyland is immediately kicked out unless someone on the ship is sick, at which case the entire ship is turned around and made to go back, or at least take port somewhere else, not in the Chandler County. And that's to illustrate that things are getting pretty bad in Greyland and that there's going to be more stuff going on with this Greyland-Emerald crisis that's going on in Chandler County. Taliesin gives the family some bread and some money, and they give her some liquor they stole from someone in the city to kind of illustrate that, yeah, these people are kind of scummy and thieving, but also, would they have done that if they weren't kicked out after basically escaping in a form of refugeehood? I don't know. That's the gray area of it. Arriving in the city, a guard asks what their business is. They show their documentation and have a little back and forth. The guard basically says to stay on your best behavior, and he makes reference to there being a crime problem where he basically just says stay inside at night, don't go out after dark, which is a hint for the party to do something in the city after dark, which they do, but it's different. We'll get to it. They park their car at the stables and make their way to the Earl, who I forget to have them be like, have their weapons taken away and be patted down and basically searched thoroughly because I wanted to illustrate that this guy was paranoid. But I forgot, so we just retconned that in, which I don't like doing, but I just wanted to establish that was something that would realistically happen. They do not like the Earl. He is a paranoid wreck. He looks disheveled. He barely cares about what's going on outside his home, let alone outside his city or the rest of his county. He talks down on his people. He calls them idiots that he doesn't care about. He's more worried about... He's actually afraid of being assassinated, but that isn't made clear to the party quite yet. And eventually he does give the party money as a reward for helping that other village, and he gives them 20,000 copper pieces. Maybe I should have just given them the money needed to level up. I probably should have, but I also really wanted to illustrate that this guy is kind of a dick because he basically gave them $20 in pennies, would be a good analogy, or like $200 in pennies. And there's also the promise that he will think of something for them to do later, which I have a few ideas, but I want the party to kind of explore the city before being given a new mission, which is mainly done by Rhinos and Ronnie. Camille, Yann's character, doesn't do much because Yann actually had to step away from the game for a moment to take care of some things, and Taliesin can't really talk to anybody because her nationality is kind of forbidden from being in the city, so she's just laying low. But Rhinos and Ronnie get up to some pretty crazy shenanigans. First, while scoping the place out, Rhinos discovers the guild hall for the Merchants Guild, goes in, and sees a bunch of business stuff going on. Bunch of basically stock trading, people arguing, yelling over each other. There's people writing on chalkboards and erasing stuff immediately all over the place. And he looks around for some guy who's being quiet by himself to kind of talk to him and get the situation explained to him. And he does find a guy in the corner who is just sitting by himself, and he goes up and asks him to explain what's going on, and he does to the best of his ability. And when Rhinos asks, what he specializes in trade in, he says, "Oh, I'm not actually a merchant. I am a artist who was paid by a merchant to draw him making a big sale." And he shows a little sketch of one of the merchants who he's being paid to draw. There is a bet between the two after they have a little back and forth where they have a little drawing competition, and even with expertise, he just rolls pretty low and Rhinos rolled pretty high. So Rhinos actually wins 150 gold. In this competition. The guy only has 50 gold to give him right now, so he does, and then later on at night, Rhinos is gonna meet up with him and get the rest of the gold. After that, he looks around for more people to talk to, decides to go to a manor house that is owned by an order of knights. He wants to hang out with them, so he just walks up to the front door and knocks on it. A old lady answers, obviously a maid of some kind or some kind of housekeeper. She asks who he is and what his deal is, and he gives a spiel, and she's like, "Okay, well, that's nice, but you can't just hang out with the knights. They're busy." Well, they're not busy, but they're like higher class people, so you can't just hang out with them. So he leaves disappointed. And I tell him, what he did was just walked up to like the police department and asked to hang out with the cops while they're doing their job, which is super suspicious. So he decides not to do that, and he looks around some more and finds the guards barracks, where he goes in and sees some guys and talks to them, and he wants to hang out with them, but then he realizes that he is quite literally just going to the police station and asking to hang out with the cops, which is super suspicious. So Rhinos just stands there while the guy behind the counter asks him who he is, if he needs help with anything, and he just leaves, leaving the guy behind the counter confused, suspicious, and that is probably going to come back to bite him in the ass later, as is the case with most of the decisions the party makes. The party reconvenes for a moment at the cart while they discuss trying to secure a tavern for the night, or rather the week, while they're waiting to hear back from the Earl. With some poor investigation checks, Taliesin decides to get the crappiest hotel they can find. It's at this moment that Rhinos tells Ronnie about the Merchants Guild, and Ronnie, who is a rogue and a thief, wants to rob them, which it's why I put the Merchants Guild there. There's also a bank and a bunch of other stuff they could rob, but this was like the first thing. So when the sun goes down and Rhinos and Taliesin go to the artist's studio to collect the money, they get it uneventfully and they return. And Ronnie, who is going through town, it's after dark, to the Merchants Guild, hears some footsteps behind him, but as he notices them with his passive perception, they flee. Possibly was going to be a mugging. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it was a serial killer. Who knows? The important thing is that his passive perception beat the active check of the person sneaking up on him, and the person bailed to avoid an actual face-to-face conflict. He does a look around the perimeter, and with a decent perception and an extremely well stealth check of 27, because it was a crit, he is able to basically climb up a tree, enter a open window on the second floor, and steal a bunch of stuff. He steals some liquor in a decanter and some crystal glasses, He steals some coins off the desk. He steals some documents that the party could use to forge things, which might be dissolved by now. I don't know. We'll figure that out when we get to it. And the most important thing he finds is there is a safe in the desk, which he lockpicks and opens, and inside is this thing. If you don't know what this is a Hero's engine. It is a very primitive form of steam engine. You put water in the little ball, and you put fire underneath it. It heats up, and as it heats up, the steam escapes through the little tubes, which pushes it in a circle, causing it to rotate around. It wasn't really used to do any work until much, much later. It was more of like a proof of concept desk toy thing. Although hilariously, there is a account of someone in Turkey using it to spin a kebab spit, and that's like one of the first instances of a steam engine being used for commercial purposes. But he steals it and then takes it to the rest of the party with all of his ill-gotten gains. With his high stealth score, he could be in and out of there like a thief in the night, quite literally. However, he wants to be theatrical, and he decides to do a backflip out the window. He doesn't make that good of a acrobatics check, and besides, is still falling like 15 feet. So he breaks one of his legs, and he limps back to the tavern, and nobody heals him. Like, he has to take the short rest to recover. He does roll max, though. He regains all of his hit points, but nobody goes through the trouble of actually healing him magically, which is quite funny, because he did it to himself. It's also like the first broken leg of the campaign. Usually that's Usopp's characters who break their legs first. But with him back at the tavern, he shows the party what he got, and they start doing history checks and intelligence checks to figure out how this thing works and what it does. The first theory is that it's some kind of pipe for smoking opium, because tobacco doesn't really exist in this setting yet, because it's based on pre-North American contact Europe, so they don't have tomatoes, potatoes, corn, tobacco, anything that is endemic to North America. Camille makes a really good history check to identify the object. He doesn't determine what it is or what it does, but he does know that this was a contraption invented by the gnomes. It uses gnomish metal, and gnomes are tinkerers, so they make this kind of stuff. Some lore about the gnomes. In this setting, they were created as a servant race by the dwarves, and they revolted against them and created their own society, where, unlike dwarves who were very rigid in their ways, the gnomes were super excited about scientific advancement, and eventually they discovered something or invented something or did something that was so big and possibly dangerous that the gods petrified almost all of the gnomes. Some gnomes fled that society and were taken in by the Fae, and they became the forest gnomes. The rest of them that were petrified became the rock gnomes. They're all just statues, and there are some that exist, whether they were unpetrified by wizards or they were just on another plane of existence at the time it happened. Doesn't matter, but there are still some. But with how hard unpetrifying things is in this setting, because it's a low magic setting, there's very few actual rock gnomes. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it's heavily inspired by the dwarves from the Elder Scrolls series. The Dwemer, the Deep Elves, they built a giant robot god machine, and then they got absorbed into it, and they all went missing. And no one knows what happened to them, and all that remains is their machines and their robots and crazy inventions and traps, which is gnomes in this setting. The party makes some more intelligence checks to try to figure out how it functions. Rhinos and Camille do pretty well, and they put water in it, put a fire underneath it, and it begins to spin, and they immediately think, this is a steam engine, we could use this for stuff. And immediately the party's plan is to buy materials to make a big one and then develop steam engines and try making a car, which I'm not opposed to. If the party wants to invent something, they can. It's just going to take a while to do it. Their plan involved like melting down all the copper pieces that was given to them to make it, or assassinating a blacksmith and taking over his forge, or just have Camille fabricate him because he's a forge cleric. In reality, what I'm probably going to have the party do, because there's still a possibility they could make one, but my actual plan is to just give them missions, or rather, give them clues and hints to point them in the direction of gnome ruins, because they have underground cities, much like the dwarves of the setting and also the Elder Scrolls, to scavenge machinery and materials to make cars, because you need to have like special gnome metal to do it, which is basically brass, but it's slightly magical. It only takes them like a couple days to figure out how the thing works and come up with ideas, and I asked the party if they have anything else to do, and they say no, so we just skip ahead, and a week goes by and the Earl does not reach out to them, probably because he's an asshole and he just forgot about them, which is the case. So they go and talk to him, they get patted down and searched and all that stuff, and when they go to court, they see that there's a bunch of people there complaining about how the city is still falling apart. There are murders that are happening at night, they believe are ritualistic. There are representatives from the Messengers Guild who are asking the Earl to draft letters in response to the things they've been sending, because people are not getting responses and they think that the Messengers Guild are just not delivering their mail. I should also mention that Ronnie was a member of the Messengers Guild, and in this setting, the Messengers Guild functions as the Thieves Guild. They're the setting's postal service, and there's also this kind of like underground secret aspect of them where they engage in fencing and paying off bounties and helping outlaws escape jurisdictions and stuff like that. Basically anything a Thieves Guild would do, only that this actually has some kind of legitimacy to it as an actual organization, because in real life, they're just not going to let a thieves guild exist. No government would allow it to happen, unless it was part of the government, which is kind of what the Messengers Guild is. But the other people that are in court complaining to the Earl are members of the Church of Rem, who is the goddess of sleep, dreams, candles, candle makers, hence it's why it's called Chandler's Cove, and for other reasons too. And also orphans and the moon. She is a goddess with a lot of domains. She is also the daughter of Thone, who is the death god, and she is also the sister of Coddard, who is kind of Talison's patron, and he's the god of failure and early demise. But the party is listening in this conversation, and there's murders happening, and like, okay, that's something we have to investigate eventually. And the party talks to the Earl after it's all cleared up, and he says, oh, I forgot about you. Just go investigate those murders. That is kind of a mission from the DM. They didn't have to do it right away, but it's something. Before leaving, notices a farmer come in carrying a basket of vegetables, and he's bringing along probably like a sheep or a cow, some kind of animal with him. I don't remember exactly what it was. It was like a medium-sized animal, where it is like slaughtered in the hall and then butchered and then prepared in front of the Earl, because he's so paranoid about being assassinated or poisoned that all of his food has to be made in front of him, to the point where it has to be slaughtered in front of him. He is very paranoid, and the party's like, okay, this guy's a mess, let's just go investigate those killings. They leave and find their way to the church, where they talk to the priest inside. Priest takes them down to the mortuary where they have bodies being prepared for burial, and Rhinos, with really good medicine checks, determines that the person who killed these people stabbed repeatedly in the lower back and stomach, and then when the person fell over, went for the eyes and face. Obviously a shorter person, very similar to the goblin attacks he saw way back in the first session, and immediately he suspects someone from Greyland, because I guess he just assumed that everyone from Greyland was also a halfling, just because the only person he knows from Greyland personally is a halfling, which is really funny. When asking for leads, the priest says that the only thing they have record of is that about 40 years ago in the sewers there was a cult of some kind who were excommunicated and kicked out of the city. And he is a little bit worried that it could be something relating to that. He's not absolutely certain, but it is a possibility, and says that it may be worth checking out. And he also gives Rhinos a old set of keys, which he believes might be able to get them into the sewers. He's not sure because he hasn't been down there ever. The last investigation was over 40 years ago. they may have changed the locks or something may have happened with that, where the keys won't work, which is the case. The party goes down to the underside of the docks and finds the sewer drain, which is locked, and it is rusted shut. The keys won't work, but Camille manages to break the metal bars, and they begin to enter the sewer, which is around the time everything goes to shit. The party enters the room with Rhinos leading the way, as he is the only one with a lit torch. Immediately they see an incomplete symbol painted on the ground and a lockbox of some sort in the bottom left corner of the room. Rhinos and Ronnie go to investigate the lockbox while Taliesin and Camille investigate the symbol. They cannot positively identify the symbol as it is incomplete. The box is locked, so Rhinos goes to check down the other corridor. Ronnie follows behind him with the box so he could stay in the bright light to avoid disadvantage on the thieves' tools checks. He does manage to get it open, and inside is some money and a spell scroll of some kind. Suddenly, Rhinos disappears down the corridor as his torch goes out, leaving the entire party in total darkness. Rhinos was sucked up into a gelatinous cube that nobody saw because their passive perceptions weren't high enough to notice it. And now they have disadvantage on those passive checks because they are in darkness now. Taliesin and Camille put their guard up as they're unsure what happened, while Ronnie lights his lantern. Rhinos manages to make the escape on his turn, squeezing out onto the other side. Unfortunately, he appears to be in some sort of dead end, with a gelatinous cube separating him from the party. Technically, at the very end of the corridor, there is a way to go straight up, but he doesn't know that because he can't see because he's in darkness. With him moving further away from the cube into the darkness and Ronnie approaching it with his lantern, the cube moves to engulf both him and Camille. Ronnie makes the save and is pushed back, but Camille is engulfed. Taliesin starts throwing rocks, which doesn't do anything. Camille uses his action to try to escape, but he fails it by 1. The cube moves forward to try to engulf Taliesin, but she's too far back, and Rhinos runs up and tries to stab it with his short sword. He avoids getting sucked into it, but his short sword is taken by it, so he is unarmed currently. Ronnie tosses the spell scroll to Taliesin, as she is the only magical team member who is not currently being eaten by a giant slime, and he decides to try to pee on it. His logic being that he's trying to dilute the acid with his urine, which isn't really going to work because it's a giant mass of acid and it just isn't going to work. Taliesin then throws the scroll to Rhinos for some reason, and Camille casts Inflict Wounds on the gelatinous cube from inside the gelatinous cube. I rule that he does not have to make a spell attack because he is completely covered by it. There's no way that he cannot touch it, and he does successfully cast it, which does hurt the gelatinous cube quite a bit. The gelatinous cube advances and engulfs Ronnie. Thinking it's going to help the situation, Rhinos uses the spell scroll without knowing what it is. Because of this, I have him roll a d3 to determine one of the random effects of the spell scroll, because he doesn't know what it is, and he rolls a 3, which gives him aquatic adaptation, as the spell scroll is a scroll of alter self. This does not help the situation at all. Taliesin continues throwing rocks at the gelatinous cube to little effect. Camille once again successfully casts Inflict Wounds on the gelatinous cube from the inside of it, which is the only thing that's really doing any damage to it. Ronnie attempts to grab his lantern, which is outside the gelatinous cube, in an attempt to set it on fire and cause some damage, but he fails his strength save. With Camille down, Rhinos goes to try to pull him out and save him so he doesn't get the instant failures from being attacked while downed, but he is pulled in himself. Taliesin continues to throw rocks at gelatinous cube to no effect. Ronnie drops from the acid damage and Camille takes an instant failure from taking damage while downed. On his turn, Yann rolls his death save for Camille and critically fails. This is his second character to die in this campaign. This is his second character to die in this campaign from a crit fail, and this is only his second character. Because it is late, his character is dead, and he is understandably frustrated at the situation. He apologizes and says he's going to turn in for the night because, he's tired, as is everyone at this point, with Yann off the call. Taliesin desperately tries to grab Ronnie's lantern to set the thing on fire and hopes of doing some damage to it, as Bo chose spells that are not very effective in combat. This is around the time Ronnie drops. Immediately after, Rhinos fails his save to escape and he too drops. Taliesin throws the lantern at the ground near the gelatinous cube, which causes it to catch a fire with oil, which begins to burn for several rounds. Over the next 2 rounds, it burns and dies, and as it dies, Ronnie fails his final death save, dying, and Rhinos passes his death save, so he has just enough time for Taliesin to come and stabilize him before he has to roll again, which ends the combat encounter with 2 party members dead, 1 unconscious and severely burned with acid, and the only person who is still conscious is completely unscathed. However, she does not have the strength to carry Rhinos out of the sewers, nor is her nationality allowed within the city walls, so any attempt at trying to get help will result in her being kicked out of the city. Now that was a lot. Like, a lot of stuff happened, and luckily, over the course of making this video, there's been lots of talks in the group, and lots of back and forth, and a lot of lessons could be learned from this encounter. The first one is that it should have been made clear that the party is going to have to do more research into monsters they're going to be fighting, or locations they're going to be investigating, or any challenge they could come up against that they're setting out to conquer. They're gonna have to think about it and approach it tactically. Just wandering into the sewer was never going to be a smart idea. If they went and did research, they would have eventually found some information about gelatinous cubes and green slimes and all that kind of stuff. From there, they could find out any kind of weaknesses and know to prepare for it, which they could have done. And that's just more so a byproduct of it being a new campaign where things are a little bit different than how I've run in the past. In the past, things just kind of showed up and you dealt with them as they showed up. But now challenges are going to be presented and they are going to need to be overcome with tactics and careful planning. Charging in head first isn't going to result in anything other than great bodily harm. Second point, get a 10-foot pole. If the party had a 10-foot pole, this entire thing would have been avoided because they would have felt the gelatinous cube and they would have been able to escape it and then maneuver around it and then continue through the sewer system to the next mini encounter. I'm kind of joking, but kind of not. A 10-foot pole is going to be very, very useful in this setting. Another thing is that it needs to be made more clear that if a problem is given, the solution will not always be given with the problem. There was a lot of focus on using the scroll that was found by the gelatinous cube to defeat it, when that never would have worked because the scroll was there to give some hints as to the practices of the cult. And the cult was down in the sewers, so the party has a reason to go down there and find treasure and fight monsters. And the hint that there was going to be a gelatinous cube down there was the fact that, other than being a sewer, the symbol on the ground that was painted, probably with blood or oil or something biological, was erased in a very clean right angle, which don't really occur in nature, with the exception being gelatinous cubes, because they are this weirdly perfect geometric thing that exists within the world of D&D. Essentially, there needs to be a better communication as what is a clue to a thing that's going to be happening and what is a possible solution to a thing that's going to be coming up. A very simple lesson is that running away is always viable. This is a slow-moving creature. It does move 15 feet, which is slower than all of them, but still faster than how I've run it in the past. But it is still something with very poor dex and not very good movement, so maneuvering around it, escaping it, all things that are perfectly viable. There was probably a moment or two where they could have escaped after Rhinos ran into it, but once he got separated and then Camille got stuck in, and then once you have 2 people in there, then you just can't escape that easily. Another very important thing is that Bo needs to pick spells that are actually useful. I get what he's going for. Problem is, what he's going for doesn't really work in the setting because you can't do subtle magic in this setting. There is a very funny clip from Mandalore Gaming, which I will play right now.
This isn't the kind of magic where you have a sparkle gun that'll get through airport security. Casting a spell in Sacrifice usually ends with a National Remembrance Day and a federal holiday. Hey, remember when that wizard came and casted a fucking volcano? Remember the Wall of Screaming Souls? You're not casting magic, you're committing magic, and that's how I like it.
And that perfectly summarizes how magic works in the setting. You don't cast spells, you commit spells. You commit magic. It's not something that is done secretly or casually. It is something that is loud, it is dangerous, it is unpredictable, and it is something that cannot really be done safely. Critically failing to cast Fireball is going to be just as detrimental to you as failing to cast Unseen Servant or Identify or Skywrite or any other spell that would be typically not very dangerous, one would think, but when you're dealing with this setting where magic is more volatile and dangerous, then you either have to commit to not doing magic, or you have to just go all out and commit to the bit. Everyone says that D&D has Vancian magic, and it kinda does in the sense that how spells are contained within the human body is very Vancian in that you have like a set amount that you release. Like spell slots are a Vancian magic idea. Problem is that in D&D, magic isn't nearly as impressive as it is in the Jack Vance novels. You cast Prismatic Orb in D&D in the Forgotten Realms, and there's a colorful ball that shoots some lasers occasionally. You cast Prismatic Orb in the Dying Earth, you destroy mountain ranges. You cause permanent damage to the local ecosystem, which is already destroyed because people have been casting spells forever. And that's a whole big tangent. The important thing is that we recommended Bo change out some spells to be a lot more immediately useful. The current spells he has for Taliesin are Magic Stone, Blade Ward, Cause Fear, and False Life. Things that aren't super helpful and haven't been helpful. Like, he has not successfully cast False Life, and I think the 3 times he tried to cast it. And it is kind of annoying, because when I realized he could have cast Arm of Agathis instead of False Life, I had a miniature brain aneurysm, because that would have basically made Taliesin a direct counter to the Gelatinous Cube, because the way I run these guys is that they're immune to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, and they're super vulnerable to things like cold damage and chemical things where it's disrupting their natural functions. Also, Eldritch Blast would have just been so much more useful. Being able to do a D10 force damage is just a lot better than a D6 plus 1 bludgeoning damage, especially when it's immune to bludgeoning damage, and it being magical wouldn't do anything about it because it's not the mundane aspect that it is immune to, like in the case of demons and devils and stuff. It's the fact that it's amorphous. Its body is just something that doesn't need to worry about physical trauma because physical trauma can't disrupt its natural organic bodily functions. And that's basically all I'm going to say about it, because I really don't like the idea of dogpiling on one of my players. It's just something I don't like. I only mention it because it's super relevant to how this specific encounter ended. I also should note that this gelatinous cube was modified to be used for the party at their current level, with their reduced hit points. That just happens because that's the nature of this game being an OSR style game. They weren't taking 3d6 or 66 acid damage. When you get sucked up into it, you take a d4 acid damage, and if you're inside of it on its turn, you take 2d4. Yann just got super unlucky because I rolled 2d4 and it came up 8. I also think I mentioned this before during the actual encounter. I'm not sure if I did, but normally if you are downed unconscious and at 0 hit points, and you take damage from someone within 5 feet of you, it counts as 2 failures for your death saves. I didn't want to do that for this monster because it would have killed them so quickly. So instead, it was only 1 death failure. I think the final lesson I have is that if you are planning to have your party level up in between a game, like in the middle of a game, just have them do it at the start of the game, like immediately, because I was gonna wait for the party to do something where they could get the opportunity to get the gold to do it, and they did it to a degree, but then they just waited for the Earl to give them an order, and then they went and did it immediately, and then almost got TPK'd. So I'm not gonna give them another combat encounter until they get to level 2. It's gonna give them just enough of an edge to kind of get the ball rolling, because it'll be 5 sessions at level 1, and that is a lot more than I wanted to. And it's not even really necessary, because with the system we have in place, the HP values still stay low. So you still feel this low HP vulnerability that the early levels get you much later, so it's not even that necessary. But giving the party the funds to level up goes into our future plans, which we're gonna just talk about right now. Starting off, I want to talk a little bit about the new characters that Yann and Mike will be playing. Yann is going to be playing a Grave Cleric. At least that's what he says he's going to be playing. We still have a couple more days before the game, and it's only level 1, so you could change it. It's not that big of a deal, but a Grave Cleric would be very appropriate because, as I said earlier, the god of funerals and the grave is the father of the god of candles, which is the god that has a church in this city, so there's a connection there. It would make sense for him to be on a pilgrimage here. And the little bit of story we came up with is that he was making a pilgrimage to the city, came across the remains of the necromancer fight, saw that the spellbook was stolen, and that the bodies were not properly buried, which means that there is someone out there who doesn't care about the dead and has a book of necromantic rituals, which basically means that a necromancer died and another one was created. So he's going to investigate that, probably go to the city, find out the same thing the party did, where there's some killings that are somewhat ritualistic, maybe some magic involved, and we're just going to have him follow the trace of the party and end up in the sewer. And he is going to be accompanied by Mike's character. He is going to be playing a ranger with Gloomstalker Conclave later on, but that doesn't happen till 3rd level, so it's a little bit away. But he's still playing a very stealth-focused character. In fact, I think he actually has the same stealth score because I gave him the favored enemy feature that normal rangers get, and I put the favored enemy as orcs, goblins, trolls, giants, basically that whole category of monster, because how creature types and categories of monsters works in this setting is different from baseline D&D. And he has a really funny backstory in that he was just a guy whose village got destroyed by orcs. He basically went around from village to village as a refugee, picking up information about different orc attacks and learning how to fight them. And now he's cultivated himself as a guy who's going to go and fight those monsters. Granted, he's only level 1, so he probably hasn't actually encountered any, except for probably as like a young kid when his village was destroyed. So he's still pretty green, ironically enough, but it's something that he's been prepping himself to do, and he's looking for an opportunity to do it. And the explanation for how he joins the party is that while tracking some orcs in the northern region of the continent, he stumbled upon Yann's character, and Yann's character, who is a grave cleric, finds this kind of unhinged recluse who's on a suicide mission to kill orcs, and his first thought is, well, this guy is going to die horribly, and it's kind of my duty as a priest of this funeral god to ensure he doesn't die alone and gets a proper burial. So he's just kind of following him along so that when he does eventually die horribly to orcs or whatever monster, then he can be there to lay him to rest properly. I also forgot to follow through on this thought, but the reason he has such a good stealth score is because I gave him the favorite enemy feature that the ranger normally gets, but I gave him the optional rules that replaces favorite terrain. So instead of just being good at one terrain, he got 2 extra languages and expertise in a skill, which was stealth. He also has Thieves' Tools proficiency from his criminal background, because he still wants to play a thief type character, and also it allows me to give the party locks and put locks and stuff as an obstacle for the party to overcome, and they could have him pick the lock for them instead of just waiting and carrying around treasure chests like they were before. And another funny part of his character is that because he's a thief, he kind of rationalizes it in his head as, well, I killed that monster over there, so you owe me. But he was never really hired in the first place, so he just kind of elected himself as monster hunter, and then just steals from the people he slayed the monster of. And what are you gonna do? Throw him in jail? He killed that he'll bring back some more goblins if you want the goblins back that much. And that'd be like a funny, cartoonishly evil thing to do where the party gets gypped on payment for clearing out some goblins. So he's like, well, screw that, and goes and finds goblins and then captures them and brings them to the village, just lets them loose. It's evil, but it's far from the worst thing any of these players have done in a game. But as the party meets 2 new guys, are just gonna follow them to the sewers and find them after the fight. Kind of poetic how if they were there, like, a minute sooner than nobody probably would have died. But that's how the game goes. Such is life. Now, there's 2 pathways the party could go. The first one is that they can continue through the sewers, at which point I'll probably put some treasure up there, and I might put another gelatinous cube somewhere where it's obvious, in the hopes that the party kind of realizes that there are dangerous things down here that can be avoided if they're careful. But probably not, because that would just be salt in the wounds. I'll think about it. It really depends on how effective healers they are and whether they could get rhinos back up or not. But if they do go through the sewer still, they're gonna have to climb up a wall, which probably have to get like a grappling hook or something. Try to climb up there, or just go back to town and get a ladder and come back. Which is always an option. They can always come back later. And I'll probably put maybe a thief's den up there, or maybe have the tunnels eventually lead back to one of the magic users that are in the city. That relates more with the Earl's plot line of him being paranoid. If they don't, then I think the other plan was going back into the city and resting up and recovering and making more plans that way. I think if that's going to happen, I might just encourage them to try pulling more heists, because it's a good way to get gold. And if they're doing stuff in the city at night, there's a chance that they could actually encounter the person involved in the killings, which honestly is probably going to be an easier fight than the gelatinous cube one. They seem to have an easier time fighting spellcasters than any other type of antagonist. And depending on any research they do, I might have them find out about a gnome stronghold in the southeast, because they're going to be heading that direction anyway eventually to get to Lockhart. And from there they could find materials to go down the steam engine plotline. And fighting gnome machines is like an entire process. And the one time I've run gnome automatons in this setting, or it was the precursor to the setting, it did not end well because, well, the people fighting them weren't very attentive, were very smart in general. But I have a lot more faith in this party. And hopefully by then they'll be a level 3 or 4, depending on how long it takes for them to travel and how many pit stops they make. So, a few more things, kind of going back to the heist idea. places that they could possibly rob or interact with. I want there to be a library of some sort which they could do research at and possibly steal from. Maybe like antique books, and maybe somewhere there is a spell scroll that's like tucked away, hidden, which they could find if their skill checks are really, really good. But mainly it'll be a research area, which I think people just don't do anymore in tabletop RPGs. Like, even in Call of Cthulhu, people don't really do research anymore as a downtime activity to kind of figure things out, which sucks because that could be like a whole thing in of itself. Since Ronnie is dead, they don't really have a connection to the Messengers Guild anymore. Not that it was really used in the first place. I might do a few more things with them. I could probably have the party run into the shovel guy who they saved about a week ago in game, and maybe he does or says something. But I'd have to give him a reason for not joining the party because they're heading towards Lockhart anyway, and he's probably want to go there eventually. I might have it so he's actually in prison or something, and they could try breaking him out. Because my original idea for how the game would pick up would be that they all start in prison after Taliesin tries and fails to get Rhino's help, but she gets arrested and he gets thrown in with her because the guards are assholes. I remember Mike saying that he wanted to have Rhinos help him rob the orphanage, which I never said there was an orphanage in the town, but there probably would be because Rem is also a goddess of orphans, so there actually would be, and it'd probably be built into or next to the church, so I could probably think of something interesting to do with that. There's also a bank for them to interact with, which they could probably use to get their gold in exchange for those copper coins, so it's less to carry. And maybe Mike will rob the Merchants Guild again, because it'd be really funny if it just keeps happening. But it's technically a different guy, who will probably coincidentally paint mustaches on all the paintings again. Also, there's like a big thing involving something that's by the Merchants Guild in the little town square, where there is this little puppet show booth, which is very important, but was kind of glossed over. I just need to get in the better habit of explaining everything that is around, because I have this thing where I'll only describe a few things, and then the party will latch on to like one of them, because obviously these things are important. They wouldn't describe something not important, which is a problem. Your players shouldn't be able to know what you're planning for them based on just what you say. It's kind of like how in old cartoons, you know a thing is going to start moving because it's not painted into the background. That was a reference Jim Davids from WebDM made like 5 years ago. I just rewatched that video. I miss WebDM, but that's a whole different thing. Another thing I want to do is I want to have a character that I've had show up in almost all of my other previous games. I have a reoccurring character who is a creepy necromancer wizard guy who collects and sells antique magic items. And because this is a low magic setting and set further in the past, I thought it'd be cool if instead of him being a creepy necromancer who has this big cluttered antique store of all this magic stuff, it's just a generally pleasant, healthy looking young man with a very organized curio shop where he's trying to be a bit of a shyster and say it's like, oh, it's mystical and magical, and who knows, when really it's all just like collectible junk. He doesn't actually have anything magical, or maybe he does and he doesn't know it because he thinks it's all just BS and he's just trying to make money off of the mysticism of it. And it would be funny if Taliesin selling him the book of spells she took from the necromancer results in the guy going down a dark path. Speaking of Taliesin, in the group chat there was talks about the spells that were being swapped out, and False Life was swapped out for Sanctuary, which is going to be a lot more helpful to the party because it could be cast on someone who is downed and then they can't be attacked as easily. And another one was the Unearthed Arcana starting spell option, which was Healing Elixir. On one hand, in the base game, it's very overpowered because it's really cheap and easy healing at low levels. However, that's what the party already has because this is a roll to cast system instead of spell slots, so they could theoretically cast these healing spells more and more often. So it's not really too overpowered in this setting. but I still want to change it because I don't like the idea of warlocks being healers. At least if they are healers, there has to be some kind of big flashy thing where it can't be done as consistently as the other classes which specialize in healing. Also, we already have a Grave Cleric who's probably gonna know a healing spell, and Mike doesn't have any plans of using too many spells, so I'm just gonna give him Cure Wounds as like a backup thing when he gets to level 2. Another thing we could possibly do for the next couple of games is involve something with the Greyland immigrants. Have something involving one of the ships where maybe someone is sick or they aren't sick and the party has to like see about that. Or maybe like a monster sneaks aboard one of the ships and a ship shows up and everyone's dead and it's quarantined because they want to know what happened before they send it back, or they don't want to put someone on the ship to do something with it if there's a monster on board, and maybe the party will go do something with that. And I know in the past, Yann and Usopp were looking for a pirate campaign, which I tried to do with Space Trucking, my previous game, but it wasn't that well done. I kind of dropped the ball on that, but the idea of them stealing a pirate ship at low level would be really fun. It'd probably end up crashing because they don't have enough people to do anything with it. They also aren't going to be able to use it to go anywhere where they have a connection to because where they're going is more inland. They could go along the coast, but that won't really help them too much when all the important stuff they're looking for is more inland. Although earlier there was a talk of there being a guy who knows Scrimshaw in the southernmost county that Rhinos wants to go talk to learn about Scrimshaw, which is the art of carving bone and teeth and ivory and whale tusks and all that crap. And I think the joke is going to be that whenever they get close, they're like actually farther away. Like they get to the southernmost county and they say, "Oh, you heard he was here." No, he's actually in this other country down south. And when they get to that other country and go all the way down, they say, "Oh, actually, he's further down south." And I want the twist to be that he is actually the Cyclops, because I want them to end up in this setting's analog to Greece if they go down that route. And there is only one Cyclops because I like there being unique monsters. Like, there's only one dragon, there's only one kraken, there's probably one beholder, there's only one living unicorn, there's only one nightmare. And being able to meet one of these legendary figures would be really cool. And I want that character to kind of tie into the one god who is the god of storms, who is kind of like a Poseidon character. He's like the god of sailing and jailers, and he's like a mix between Thor and Poseidon, essentially. And if he's his father, then that's like a cool thing. And it ties into like the Greek myth of the Cyclops are the children of Poseidon. It also had some more lore stuff, but that's like way, way, way down the line, even if they decide to follow that plot line. It's more just like a thread that's out there than something they're actually going to actively seek out and do. Like, the party probably forgot about it by now. I almost forgot about it. I just happened to be thinking of ideas. And speaking of unique legendary creatures, I had an idea of either in this city there is in the sewers a dead or dying aboleth that is going to slowly reform, or just somewhere else there is an aboleth that is like taking over a small village or a city or something. I want the party to fight one of them eventually, because aboleths are either very dangerous or not very dangerous, and I want to kind of rework them to be a more so middling creature. Like, hags are really good low level big bad evil guys. Aboleths are more so good middle to early level bad guys. And then after that you get like liches and elder brains and all that crap that is like super higher level. But the party's only level 1 now, and they've been level 1 for like a month, so it's something I just need to not focus too much on now. The big stuff, I gotta push it out because we gotta focus on the micro. Micro, not macro. World building is fine, but I don't want to keep dumping lore and stuff on the party, and then they just have so many stuff to do and they never do any of it. That was a big problem with urban fantasy, where more and more stuff kept happening and being added on to, and they just never investigated it or fell through with it. Granted, I didn't put a lot of energy into it because a lot of what I did for that game was improv, which I still do improv, but I'm kind of toning it down for this one. Not only because I really want to put a lot of focus on this game and make it truly something special, but also I have the Game Diary series, which lets me catalog my thoughts and gives me like the focus I need to actually sit down and make a map and make stat sheets and basically just make stuff ahead of time instead of just cropping stuff up like an hour beforehand and then quickly sketching out a map. That's good for some games, like the tavern game I run every month or so. A lot of that's improv and goofy shenanigans because it's a beer and pretzel type game. Whereas I want this one to be more serious and focused and strategic. And speaking of prepping, I'm gonna wrap up this video and actually start making preparations because at the time of recording right now it is Sunday, and that means I have like 3-4 days before the next game, and I want to get a bunch of stuff done. And also I have my other project, which I don't know if I ever talked about on the channel, but I'm working on another D&D video. It's basically making fun of and talking about terrible homebrew on the D&D wiki. The one that everyone knows about, the infamously bad nonsense, because I just randomly found a thing called the Wumbo superposition, and it kind of broke my brain, so I had to talk about it. And with my new editing skills I kind of picked up while making this video, hopefully that one will be really, really good. At least the intro is. It uses a lot of my taste of humor, which is annoying and dismissive. Also, I've almost completely abandoned the fish tank thing. It's nice getting some views trickle in, but I just don't have the patience to rewatch all of Fish Tank Season 2 and talk about it. It's also a very negative thing, I think, and I just got my old Twitter back again, so I'm trying to be more positive and just kind of refocus and rebrand into D&D and comedy, as opposed to just being an ass on the internet. And I still haven't thought of a good way of ending these videos. If you have a way for me to end, then comment it down below in the comment section. And also, give me your thoughts on this video and maybe some things I should have changed about the encounters and the game, or what you thought about the little battle sequence with the gelatinous cube. Any comments help with engagement. Like if you liked it, obviously. Subscribe if you want to see more D&D related content, which is going to be what I'm focusing on more now. And if you made it this far in the video, then comment chariots, chariots. That's why I put them in the description, and one guy has done it. So yeah, thanks for watching and or listening. I apologize for the poor quality. It's not going to get any better.